Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Ellensburg, Washington, USA. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, this evening, or tomorrow morning, depending on where you are in the world. I'm grateful to you for taking time out to join us live. Nothing more sad than holding a party and having nobody show up. And we've already got 300 people waiting, so thanks. The local time is 1:48, I think, something like that, 1:48, and we'll start this program in about 12 minutes. Why not? Breaking out some of the special mugs that Kirk in Philomath, Oregon, created for Liz and I. This is a subduction special. So thank you for the gifts. I've been using them for more than a year, but I thought, you know what? Let's start using them here. So thanks, Kurt. Let me say hi to a few, and then I will email the guest, who is Will Matthews up in Calgary, Alberta. But let's scroll back here and just grab a few locations. And I see some 5x5, so I won't even ask about that. Oscar's in San Diego. Ottawa, Canada. Hello. Kyle's in Australia. Oh, no, that's Kathy. Have a good one in Brisbane, Australia. Rogue Valley, Oregon. I'm back a ways. Michael's in Ireland. Chris is in Rockland, California, I think. Peter's in Dayton, Ohio. Bjorn's in Menominee, Michigan. Florida. Paul's in Glasgow, Scotland. Hello. Good evening to you. It's flirting with freezing around here. We got up above freezing yesterday and had some sun. That was a nice brief thaw, but otherwise we've been chilly here. I'm sure not as chilly as where you are. I'm sure not as warm as where you are. Yeah. Bergen, Norway. Hello. There's a cold evening in Sweden, says Ulf. -7 centigrade outside in Stockholm tonight. In Gamlastan. I have good memories with our young boys and Liz walking around Gamlastan in Stockholm. I hope I have the right city. Houston, 5x5, Northwest. Okay, so I do need to email the guest before I forget, and then we'll go back to saying hi to some other folks. And again, I'm happy to see the 5x5. Thank you. I'm getting more and more confident. Add the guest, copy the link, boy. Go over. Paste the link into the email for Will from my Gmail to his Gmail. This is yet another Nanaimo show. So we have yet another Nanaimo bar, and there's one more Nanaimo bar in here because we've got another Nanaimo show on Saturday. Come on, man. I said it was a trilogy. It's a four-parter. What do you call that? Maybe 5 if you count the Jerome fiasco last week. Let's not think about that. Say hi to a few more here. I'm live. Tim is in Camas, Washington, and Steve's in Milwaukee, Oregon. Steve, I remember fondly your aunt and uncle, was it, who lived in Ellensburg a while back. Elaine's in Tucson. Stephen's in Selwood in Portland, Oregon. Honey Greg says 3 cheers for Jeff at Vinman's Bakery. Matt says Vinman's Bakery. You got to love it. Gordon says good evening, Nick, from Glasgow, and set a temperature there that already scrolled by. Sven in Hamelin, Germany. San Saba, Texas. Hello. Where's my mouse? Bro, where's my mouse at? Where's my mouse at? 450 people with us now. Continuing to roll in. Jerome says, hi, Nick. I'm Jerry from Jarrett, Virginia, USA. There's Vinman's Bakery. He's in the hizzy. Vinman's in the hizzy. Moto Mining. Okay. All right. Jennifer's in Boise. Hello, Jennifer. Lori and Red and plenty of familiar names. Black Cell 22 says aloha from Hawaii. That's nice. Mark's in Leamington Spa, UK. Geologically speaking, that's Todd in Southern California. Lake Orion, Michigan. Zuzana is from the Czech Republic. Hello, Zuzana. Must be after dark there, I'm guessing. Oh, I see Will in the green room. That's a thumbs up. That's a good thing, Will. Thank you for making that happen. One less thing to be concerned about. And Ann is in San Diego, California. Kyle Roth in Reston, Virginia. Frank. Hey, Frank, you're a regular. You're a former student of Bob Miller. Are you the Frank I'm remembering? Mice in the pantry. Caught 10. Oh, Frank's been busy today. Angola, New York. That's Larry. And we have someone from Athens, Greece. Hi. Hello from North America. Jim says, howdy from Lake Koshkonong. That's my old stomping ground near Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin, where I grew up. Hello, Lake Koshkonong. Chilly, San Diego, Nina. Lay it on us. How chilly is chilly? Let's just compare. It's, how chilly is it for you guys down there? I'm guessing 51 Fahrenheit. Whatever. Dan, I see you, man. Dorset, UK. You're here almost every time. Thank you. And Elaine says it's 66 degrees in Tucson. Wah, wah. Yeah. All right. Well, I hope everything's going well. I think let me make a quick announcement. I'll do this announcement again after we start. I'll probably do that same announcement right as we sign off today. But there's a scheduling note. I gave my final exam yesterday for the Geology 101 students. Lots of heartfelt comments as people were leaving the room. Unusual. There's always a couple, but I mean, it was a lot. So we had a special thing going, the 75 kids in Geology 101 this quarter. But we're done. I haven't graded yet, but we're done. So this building will become a ghost town. It kind of is already, but definitely by Friday, nobody will be in the building. And I mentioned that because it's dark. My wife is still working at the high school through next week. And what else is there to do? The good college basketball games are kind of done for the next couple of weeks. So I'm just like I did last winter, I'm doubling up. Here's what I mean. So this is your first look at it. And if you're wanting to join us live, this is just like we did last December, identical to what we did last December. So here we are on December 7th. Yes, we'll have a show Saturday morning, but we're going to have a show on Sunday morning at 9 o'clock as well. Then Wednesday, then Saturday, then Sunday, and then our final show before Christmas time, Wednesday, December 21st. We'll take a break for the holidays, and then we'll be back at it on January 4th. So I'll remind folks of that a little bit more, but this just helps me get through a very quiet, kind of dark, dead time, and I'm not much of a hobbyist, so I'd rather just keep rolling with this stuff, just personally, and visiting with you guys and continuing to learn things. So I know it's a busy time for many of us, and if you're like, come on, man, I barely am keeping up now. You're adding another show on each weekend. You really expect me to be, totally on my game? Well, I don't know. You can do what you want, but I hope you can. Whether it's live or in replay, I hope you can stick with us. I'd hate to have a bunch of people leave. I don't think that's happened yet. And I'm personally really enjoying these episodes thus far. I hope you are too. So here's to you here's to you. Ned Zinger Overload. Exactly, Saber. I think Liz is officially on Ned Zinger Overload since 1991. So we had our first child, by the way. And a new man was in her life. His name was Max. Zuzana, reporting in the Czech Republic. She watches the replay mostly because of work. I totally understand. That's why it's so extra special to have so many, 550 right now, watching live. You don't have to watch live, obviously, but those that make it a point to watch live with us, you're really helping this experience out, because we, of course, always have live question and answer for our guests, and I really like that part of the show. And if there were 13 people watching live, it wouldn't work. So I'm not sure I've said it much in quite some time. Maybe I've never said it. I want to say a special thank you to those of you who make sure to watch some of these live. Not everyone, but many of them. A regular live crowd, it makes this work. These are called live streams. And so I'm especially grateful to you all. A couple more, and then I got to get my head right. We're almost to the top of the hour. Thomas is in Mainz, Germany. Marie's in Rhode Island. Sky Fox says, I like the name Zentner. That's a new one. Right. Victoria, BC. Yeah, we got a bunch of Canadians here today, perhaps. Vancouver, BC. Hello, Dirja. Patrick's in Rochester, New York. Snarky User is in Ellendale, Minnesota. Daryl's in Newcastle, Australia. Seth's in Alabama. Yeah, somebody else said that, Papagino. I guess there was a big win for I think it's the Kansas State football team, and the punter or kicker or somebody had a game-winning field goal. His last name was Zentner. There's not many of us, so I must be related somehow, but I'll have to get to the bottom of that. Okay, we got 2 minutes. Thank you for joining us today. I need to get my head right. 2-minute warning before we start today. Thanks again for joining us live. Hot mic. Okay. All right. Keep the energy up. You've got hardly anything on the laptop. So I think you're coming to Will sooner than normal. Although maybe not, because you've got a few extra things planned, don't you, on the chalkboard. And you haven't practiced it, but you have a rough idea of what you want to do. You might get tripped up on those dates. You might get tripped up on a couple other things, but just keep rolling. You have a guest who can set you straight. It's okay if you screw up. This is not easy stuff today. But you're not expected to do all the hard stuff. That's why you have a guest. They know the hard stuff. They have it all ready to go. They have it in their head. Rely on them. But your role is to set up the guest and to do some broad stuff and to continue the narratives going from the last show. You can do that. You can do that. It's not hard. You need that time stick, though. Get that time stick on. Time stick is right here. Don't forget about it. You sure you're ready? Pleasant good afternoon to you all. Thank you for joining us for session F, called Nanaimo Sources, kind of a strange title, with Will Matthews. I'm so glad that you're with us. I have a role here, and that is to keep some storylines going, some narratives going. I feel like that's what I can do in a classroom setting in general. I like to tell stories, but almost some of the geology is learned almost without people realizing it, because it's kind of a story tale type of an approach. It sounds like a super dumb way to teach science, but I guess I've realized that over the years, that I like narratives, and that's part of what I'm doing here. We visited with Danny Coots last time on Saturday morning. I hope that you saw that show, and we continue with Danny's work with today's guest, Will Matthews. Those guys were fellow graduate students at University of Calgary, so it's a perfect continuation of last show and this show. That said, I have just a couple of quick things on the chalkboard to go. But before we get there, I want to make sure that you know, if many of you have just tuned in, that we've got a scheduling addition like we did last winter. Here we are, session F, and the next show will be session G on Saturday morning at 9 a.m. Pacific time, and our guests will be Brian Mahoney and Paul Link, two guests on Saturday morning. And we will be continuing to talk about the Nanaimo group and continuing to talk about the data sets that we're talking about today, but there will be a very different take on Saturday morning. Get your popcorn ready. But I'm also showing this to you because I'm adding 2 Sunday shows for the next couple of weeks for reasons I just discussed 20 minutes ago. So I have invited Aaron Donaghy from Purdue University, a favorite from last winter, to come back and join us on Sunday morning for session H. And then we continue with 4 more shows before we take a break for the holidays. So adding extra shows in December, primarily because the building is empty, there's nothing else going on, it's dark. It's time to just continue to learn things with you, and hope you enjoy those extra shows. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this. What do I mean, Nanaimo stratigraphy? You can maybe guess, but I don't think maybe hardly any of you, terrible grammar, can guess what I mean here, and I'm choosing blue chalk for a reason. Probably stupid, but the old PCers. That'll be my phrase I'll try out today. We'll see if we like it. The old PCers. So let's get right to it. The paper that we're looking at today at nickzentner.com. You know what? Let's go there now. Why not? Let's get there now. Let's go. This is my only time I'm going to the laptop today. Unusual to go here so early, but let's try it. So this is what nickzentner.com looks like. Hey, it's secure, everybody. And we click on Baja in the upper right-hand corner. That's how to get to these scientific papers. And you might notice that I flipped the order of these things. So I'll put the freshest or the newest paper at the top, and then our prior scientific papers from past shows will descend down this way. So session A with Linda Nosen and Merle Beck is down here at the bottom. Okay, if I click on the second from the top, that's Danny Kutz's Nanaimo paper from 2020. And I remind you that Danny visited with us a few days ago. And I want to zero in just as a little primer. So this is why I'm doing this now. Close your eyes if you're going to get seasick. It may be stupid to do it this way, but whatever. Come on, baby. Where is it? Here we go. So to me, this is where things got extremely interesting in the last show. And I'm going to sketch this out on the chalkboard a little bit, but you might recall that I was initially confused by these blue squares that Danny is calling facies 2 sediment pathways. And the facies 2 sediment pathways within the Nanaimo group begin 84 million years ago, and they're consistently happening until about 72 million years ago, I think. So that's the blue chalk that I'm talking about today, and I'll elaborate on that. But now, the brand new paper, and I mean brand new, this thing came out and became public, like open access, like a couple days ago. So you're getting a chance to see this thing before anybody, really. And the lead author is a master's student, Marie Bonvin, that's French. And I believe her supervisor was Will Matthews, our guest today. And there you see Danny, and then you can see both of their supervisors, Stephen Hubbard. But this is the paper du jour. What? This is the paper today that I'm going to get us started on with the chalkboards. And then I know that Will has a few slides he wants to share, maybe even this sexy map right here. And we'll just continue our story. So that's all I have from the laptop today. And so my attempt with the chalkboards is to, I think, grab what I got most excited about from Danny's show and what I think I understand from Will's paper after reading it 3-4 times in the last couple of days. And then we'll kick it to Will, and we'll just go from there. Okay? That's the plan. So what do I mean, the old PCers? This is PC. This is pre-Cambrian. We didn't get there last time, but we're going to get there right away right now. If you remember Danny talking about these contentious sand grains in the Nanaimo, part of the F2 tiles, the contentious sand grains, the grains that everybody's talking about, the sand grains that have all sorts of vigorous debate about. Most of them are from the Precambrian. He goes to the geologic time stick. Here's the geologic time stick. The beginning of the Earth is down here. Present day is up here on top. Cenozoic, going back further in time, that's the Mesozoic era. Going back further in time, that's the Paleozoic era. Going back earlier than the Paleozoic era is the Precambrian, and in blue, there are two clusters of ages of sand grains in the Nanaimo, in the upper Nanaimo. A bunch of Precambrian grains, sand grains that cluster around the date 1.7 billion years old. In other words, 1,700 million. And another cluster of sand grains that are about the age 1,380 million or 1.38 billion. Those are the old PCers. I don't know if I'll stick with that phrase, but I thought it was kind of catchy. So you can see it down here. I've got those two age clusters. I've got them in blue to match nicely with our F2 blue tiles from Danny's paper. And I want to cut to it. The most thrilling part of the new paper that will be the centerpiece of our discussion with Will are these rims. I'm not going to write it all out. But each of these old Precambrian sand grains, I guess almost all of them, have these newly discovered rims, and the rims are metamorphic. So we have sand grains that are sedimentary in origin, that's the blue, with a metamorphic rim surrounding them. I'm not sure if this is the first discovery, the first time we've discovered these metamorphic rims from the Nanaimo, but I think it's the first. If it's not, it's the first time that they have been discussed in a major scientific paper and talking about the implications of trying to use those metamorphic rims. They're not orange colored, but I've chosen orange here for that. Okay? So these are the stars of the show, these old PCers that are in the Nanaimo group. Okay, let's go to the stratigraphic column, see if we can figure out where we can place those old PCers. So this thing's going away. I don't know if I'm going to use it again. You'll notice I'm dancing with the chalkboards and I have a different use of the chalkboards. What did I want to do here? Yeah, quickly, very quickly. You've seen this 2 different shows now, but I'm going to do it again very, very quickly in case you've missed a couple of shows. Here's our confetti cake, our Nanaimo group that is sitting firmly on top of the Baja BC block, aka Insular and Friends. No, Insular Superterrain. The Nanaimo goes from 90 million years ago to 66 million years ago, and we care about the Nanaimo, and we're spending 4 shows early in the alphabet on this Baja BC Livestream series. We're spending 4 shows on the Nanaimo because it was deposited on top of this block that apparently has been moving north between 85 and 55 million years ago. Up until this paper today, the way that I have taught it, and I think the way anybody's thought about this Baja BC thing is those blue grains are coming from the craton. I'm ahead of myself now a little bit, but I feel like freelancing. And that the source of those old PCers, blue, is coming from the craton and getting transported to the confetti cake and deposited during Nanaimo time. But we're going to realize pretty quickly that this new paper says that's not necessarily the way to think about this. To have these old Precambrian grains coming directly from the craton without any sort of metamorphic activity. Are you intrigued? Are you confused? Are you both? Are you neither? Whatever. Let's go to what the main thing I wanted to do on the chalkboard. I'm going to try to fit all this on one chalkboard, the old greenie that I've used to use just for the introduction, but I think I'm going to feature it now today. All right, let's give this a try. Keep it going, boy. Keep it going. Will, I'm probably coming to you in 10 minutes or so if I try to keep the pace going here a bit. Okay, let's start first with the Nanaimo. I got to go to the notes now. Let's go to some of the main things that we learned from Danny last time, corroborated by Will. These guys have been working together for many, many years now up in Calgary. All right, lower, upper Nanaimo. You know where we are. The blue confetti cake sitting on top of Insular. So the Baja BC block is the basement essentially for the Nanaimo. And it's the Baja BC block from Basil's show. That's the thing that is hitting 100 million years ago. Let's just use that today. So we're creating a major Baja BC block. We're not sure where. We're not sure if it's up here. We're not sure if it's in Idaho. We're not sure if it's in Southern California. We're not sure if it's in Mexico. That's the whole point of studying this stuff today. But we know, at least for our discussion purposes and taking the lead from Basil, that we accrete this Baja BC block to the rest of North America 100 million years ago. Shortly after, starting 90 million years ago, we start depositing sand on top of the Baja BC block. That's known as the Nanaimo group. So the Nanaimo goes from 90 million years ago up to 63 million years ago. Do you remember this now? This is before Silesia accretes. This is before the Chuckanut or the Swak. This is after the docking of Rangeli and friends and before the docking of Silesia, if you have a good memory from last winter. Okay, what did we decide from Danny's show the difference between the lower and the upper Nanaimo is? There are many differences, but one way to think about this is that the lower, I'm not even going to write it. The lower Nanaimo is a bunch of sand and cobbles and coal, if you remember, coal seams that were deposited in lagoons, estuaries. We are either kind of marginal to a marine setting or we are not marine, the lower Nanaimo. And then as we go to the upper Nanaimo, we get into deep water. The submarine fans that Danny was discussing and giving us some visuals about. So I got a few emails from some of you since the last show. By the way, thanks for all the emails. I get about 100 emails a day. I can't reply to most of them. I read every one. I thank you for the links and the thoughts and everything else. I just can't reply. Please forgive me. But more than one of you were saying, did I get that wrong? Wouldn't the lower Nanaimo be the deep stuff? And then you build this confetti cake until it gets out of the water and it's marginal marine and then it's non-marine? Wouldn't it make sense to go from starting the cake when the water's deep and then basically filling the body of water until the top of the cake is out of the water? I guess that makes sense, but that's not what happened here. So our interpretation is we start depositing sand of the Nanaimo on top of the Baja BC block when it's at sea level, even slightly above sea level, and then starting about 84 million years ago, there's a major change. So the boundary between the upper and lower Nanaimo is 84 million years ago, and one way to think of that change is we go from at sea level to clearly below sea level. And pretty quickly we're into deep ocean water, deep sea water. These submarine fans being sent deep down the continental slope, I guess. So there is rapid sinking of the top of the Baja BC block. That's kind of weird to me. Like we just accreted this thing 100 million years ago, and then we're pretty quickly, within 15 million years, dropping this thing. Why are we dropping it? Why are we subsiding the crust? The sedimentation within the Nanaimo tells us that's happening. We're not even talking about moving north. We're just talking about at sea level and then below sea level pretty quickly to marine material. Okay, that's not the only major change. The other major change that Danny and Will's facies number 2 in blue with the contentious sand grains, meaning the old PCers, are starting to show up in the confetti cake. So in addition to grains that are from the local neighborhood, in addition to sand grains throughout the Nanaimo that's coming from either Rangelia or then especially in upper Nanaimo coming from the bedrock to the immediate east, the Coast Plutonic Complex, or I guess the immediate south, which is Darrell Cowan's Northwest Cascades thrust system stuff. In addition to that, that's what all these yellow sand grains are. Those aren't the contentious ones. The contentious ones we're coloring blue. And between 84, and I think I have this right, between 84 and 72 million years ago, more than 30% of these sand grains are blue. The contentious sand grains, the old PCers. You're like, what is this again? Those are the grains that are either that date or that date, the old PCers. These things are way, way too old to make sense with this depositional basin. So where are these things coming from? Why would we have such old sand grains, and not just a couple of them, dumping into the Nanaimo Basin? Again, the magic time is between 84 million years ago and 72 million years ago, and then I think I understand that it stops. And the blue sand grains, the old PCers, stop coming in. They stop arriving. Now, I'm not going to take the time. Well, I should find the orange chalk. Hang on, Patrick. Oh, shit, where is it? Sorry, Patrick. Here, orange. Do you remember what orange signifies from our introductory chalkboard? That's my first question to Will when I'm coming to him in about 5 minutes. Is he the first guy to study these zircons in the Nanaimo to the amount of detail where he can find these little metamorphic rims? Yes or no? And then if he is, why are those metamorphic rims that surround almost every one of these old PC grains in the upper Nanaimo, why might they be important? I'm going to say it verbally, and then I think we're going to Will. Not quite. Sorry. I want to use this map. Okay, well, let me try to, I set it up for myself, so let me go ahead and say it. These metamorphic rims, and it's just like it sounds, there's a halo or there's a rim around these detrital grains that were created in a metamorphic condition. You need high temperatures and high pressures to create those metamorphic rims. Those metamorphic rims for these grains in the upper Nanaimo are important because they say, look, these old PCers have to come from a place that's meta-sedimentary bedrock. You need the bedrock itself to have a metamorphic quality to it. And that's the last thing I'm doing, because up until the discovery of these metamorphic rims, and if you were with us 2 years ago in my living room when I was doing this for the first time and reading Will's papers and others, this is 5 years ago, the thought was, where can we find old sedimentary rock of North America's craton? In other words, where can we find bedrock anywhere in the American West that matches with these two dates? And up until this paper, the thought was, well, you have two choices. There's a place called the Lemhi Basin, named after one of the beautiful mountain ranges in central Idaho, where I met Liz, where I went to grad school. This place is near and dear to my heart. There's a bunch of Belt Purcell supergroup rock, Precambrian bedrock of the Lemhi group. And there's a group of researchers for many decades now that will be with us on Saturday morning that say this is the source of the old PCers. And therefore, they say the Nanaimo was maybe right next door to the Lemhi and then was moved up to its current location by Jerome Lessman's house. In other words, if you're a big fan generally of the Lemhi part of the craton being the source of the old PCers in the Nanaimo, you don't want the Nanaimo being down here. You're low on the scale of 1 to 10. You want the Baja BC block to be here, and then you move it north. That's maybe less than 1,000 kilometers of northward movement. But there is another choice that has historically been offered as the source of the old PCers. And that's another part of old North America, the craton of North America, down here in Southern California and Nevada, known as the Mojave, or also called the Yavapai and Mazatzal craton. I don't know what I'm talking about now. So if you like these old PCers in the Nanaimo matching the ages and the other detailed chemistry of the Mojave, then you've got the Baja BC block with the Nanaimo on it down here, and then we got to get it up north. You're starting to see why this has been a point of discussion for a long time, why it has been contentious. And these groups generally do not see eye to eye in scientific papers. But today's paper says two main things, and then I'll throw it to Will. 2-minute warning, Will. One thing that Will says in this new paper is, I don't think either of these is the source for the old PC zircon grains in the Nanaimo, because there's metamorphic rims around almost every one of these guys in the upper Nanaimo, and there's no metamorphic rock in either of these Precambrian source regions. So let's get these off the table. If you really look carefully at my metamorphic rims on these grains. And by the way, if you're curious about the age of the metamorphic rims, they're younger than 100 million years old. The rims are not Precambrian. One more time. The nucleus or the detrital pit of each of these old zircon grains in the Nanaimo are down here in the Precambrian. But now I'm saying that the metamorphic rims around the detrital zircons are younger than 100 million years, possibly in the age window of Baja BC, but I don't know that. Last thing is that Will is wondering if there is a bunch of old PCers coming from the Lemhi, but we get them down south, and that's where I lose it. I'll admit it. So we need an expert. That's where I lose it. Okay, I'm getting my headphones, Will. We're coming to you. We've got, how many? We got 830 people watching. Terrific. Battery 100%. And I'm connected to the right laptop. And that looks good. Hi, Will. How are you today?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for joining us. You're sounding great. You're looking great. How's the weather up there in Calgary today?
We had a Chinook blow in overnight, and so it went from minus 20 Celsius yesterday to minus 1 today. So 20 degree shift, and it happened through the night when the sun wasn't shining. We big wind blew in, and it blew most of the cold air out of town. It's still really cold in the valleys where you can't, the wind can't sort of mix the air out and it stays cold.
Yeah.
But up on the top here, outside of the valley, it's beautiful.
That sounds delightful. I think we had something similar come through today. So there's the end of the weather portion of it. And I was just checking your audio is wonderful. You were a little bit pixelated and a little bit frozen, but we'll hope it settles down. I think we're making this work. I promised I would start with this. Are these metamorphic rims of these old grains, is that a new discovery?
So I don't think you could measure grains from the Nanaimo Basin without noticing that there's problems. These rims make measurements of the grains very complicated. And so I suspect that even the earliest dates, from the Nanaimo Basin back in, Pete Mustard era, 1995, where they're doing Tim's dates, dissolving entire grains, they noticed there was a lot of isotopic problems with the grains. And so they probably knew that there was something going on. But we were the first to sort of put it in a paper in 2017 when we said, hey, there's lots of rims on these grains. And then we're the first to dive in there and really try to figure out, what they mean, how old are they, what they tell us about the source area.
Well, it's tremendously exciting. Like, I'm really fired up about this stuff for the first time. So thank you for that. I'm going to continue to try to read that paper and make more sense of it, especially after I get a little bit more juice out of you right now. So before we go in that direction, how long have you been at the University of Calgary? For quite some time. Did you overlap with Danny Coots as grad students?
Yeah, so I started in 2010, and I think Danny started shortly there, just after me. And so we overlapped for, 3 or 4 years during our PhDs, different supervisors, but doing related things. Danny was more into, sedimentology and stratigraphy. And then he did the detrital zircon thing to try to figure out the ages of some of the coarse grained units that he was mapping in the field. And then I was really interested in tectonics. I was doing a tectonics focused PhD. And so we got together and it was a perfect synergy. He had the field skills and the determination to date a pile of rocks. I wanted the dates so I could talk about, Baja BC problems. And so it was great. So we managed to do a bunch of really cool work, through the end of my PhD and just after that.
And who is Marie? She was the lead author on this new paper.
Yeah, so she was my former supervisors and then my student. She finished her master's with me in, I think, 2019 maybe, or 2020. She finished her master's. So she was a master's student and did basically all the laboratory work, did a lot of the interpretation of the data. These types of data aren't really simple. You don't just sort of stick the grain into a black box and a number pops out. There's some interpretation required and it's quite time consuming. And she did all that work. Yeah. So she wrote the first copy of this paper. It's been around a few times before we managed to get it out into the world. And so she wrote the first copy. I always think that the student should be, if they did the work, they should be the first author on it. And I'm really a stickler for that. And so she's happy now that her master's thesis has finally been published.
Well, that's really cool. And I don't know why University of Calgary has such a fancy lab for this. Is there a backstory there? Did you start the lab? You were the manager for a while, right?
Yeah, I was the manager for 8 years. We built the lab in 2014. We got a big grant from the government. Well, big by Canadian standards. This was not like an NSF, big grant by American standards. This was a big Canadian grant, a joint between the federal government and our provincial government. And we got to build the lab, and that was great because I actually bent the pipes and plugged the wires in and learned how to use it and developed uranium lead dating at the University of Calgary. And then I ran the lab during my PhD, and then I ran it after my PhD while I was a professor, and then I ran it for a couple of years just as a lab manager. And wow. And that's why we have it. It's actually mostly a thermochronology lab, so more interested in the time temperature history of rocks than a geochronology lab. But the work I do is mostly geochronology, and so that's how I've used it.
Terrific. Well, I thank you for that backstory. It's helpful, and I see that you have some slides. I don't know how you would like to proceed here.
So I want to start by just fixing one thing on your board.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
So the old PCers start in the basin at 84 million years. And they continue in the basin for as young a stratigraphy as we have. So they go all the way to the 63 million years.
Okay.
So the 72 is basically when we find the grains throughout the basin in all areas. So before 72 million years, we only find it in the sort of central and southern part of the basin. And then after 72 million years, they're everywhere. All of the detrital zircon signatures from all of the rocks we sample after 72 have the old PCers in them. And so that's what the change is at 72. It becomes actually more widespread after 72
Oh, wow.
than it was between 84 and 72.
And still with the rims, like, are you really saying that like damn near every old PCer has a rim, a metamorphic rim?
Yep, that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Wow.
So when we first waded into this problem, we had images of the grains. So we had made mounts to make, to do some dating, and we thought, wow, there's also these isotopic complexities. We don't know what's going on. These grains look like they're two ages. What does this mean? So we got some CL imagery, cathodoluminescence imaging. It's a way of using an SDM to make the grains bright and light up. And they tell us information about the internal structure of the grains. So we got some imagery, and it showed these rims on the grains. And we were like, well, that's pretty interesting. The basin itself is not metamorphic. It has some diagenesis, some very low temperature alteration of some minerals, but it's not metamorphic, right? It's never been thick enough. It's never been buried. It's never been cooked. And so we knew that these rims couldn't have grown in the basin. They must have grown in the source area and then come with those grains into the basin. And so these were part of the detrital signature, like all the rest of the sediment. And what that meant was that, there's this contentious debate about where these come from, and the ages alone of these grains, that 1380 and 1700, those two Precambrian ages you showed, that isn't, well, it is fairly unique, but it's not like crazy unique where it would be unreasonable to suggest that it might come from either the north or the south. And that's why there was this sort of running debate going back and forth. And we thought, okay, if these rims are on the old PCers and they're going to tell us an additional piece of information about where these grains come from, we should put some effort into measuring them. And maybe that additional information will be able to discriminate between the northern Lemhi Basin possibility and the southern Mojave possibility. Because we thought, okay, those two areas have their own geologic history, and these rims will tell us about the geological history of the source area. So let's measure them and see what happens. And it turns out it's really hard to measure them because they're really, really thin. And actually, I'll just go ahead one on my slide here, and I'll just show. I have some pictures of the rims here that I'm not going to get into the details because it'll shock and scare people. But you can see on this, I'll just get myself a pointer. Hopefully people can actually see a pointer if I use it. Can you?
We can see.
Can you see that? Yeah. So
we can.
Yeah. So all these are zircon grains. I just want to give you a sense of the scale of these. This bar here is 40 micrometers long. So that's less than a 20th of a millimeter in length. So these grains are really, really small. Like I want you to think of a sand grain. A sand grain is big compared to most of the zircons that we actually measure in a rock. And so these grains are quite complicated. These are, for somebody who dates igneous rocks, these are terrible looking zircon grains. But a lot of people probably can see that often in the middle of the grain, there's like some sort of pattern of light and dark areas. And here's another one. It's got some pattern of light and dark areas. This one's got no patterns inside it at all. It's just kind of homogeneous. And then on the outside of them, there's this other material, right? That looks different from the inside. And it varies a lot. Some of them are really bright and thin, and some of them are really thick and have this bright and dark lines in them. And then there's some that have like the core is all oscillatory zoned, we call that, or zoned. And then the outside is just a mess. And so I think I can be done with that slide now if you want to put it away.
Sure.
So these rims they vary a lot in thickness. Some of them are thick enough that we could just take a laser and we could just shoot them and we could get a date from them. The smallest beam diameter that we can use is about 22 micrometers. And so some of the rims are big enough, we could just shoot them and get a date. But a lot of them, probably like at least probably 3/4 of them, were so thin that we wouldn't be able to use a beam diameter big enough to get enough material that we could actually make a good measurement. So we could probably get a spot small enough. We could probably measure some material from it, but we would get an age that's very uncertain. We wouldn't have a very good idea what the real age is. It'd be like, it's 100 million years plus or minus 30 million years, which it's not good enough, right, to really tell us anything new. So what Marie did was we decided we would use a different technique called depth profiling. And in normal geochronology, we take these grains and we cast them in epoxy. And then so here's the grain. Of course, it's really, really, really small, but okay, we're going to pretend it's this big. We take the grain, we cast it in epoxy, and then we cut it in half by grinding it. And that lets us see the interior. And then we measure the interior of the grain. Okay, and that's those images we just looked at. Those are the interiors of the grain. That's how we normally do geochronology. But with these really thin rims, we don't actually have a big enough area to make the measurement we want to make. So what we do instead is we just take the grain and we just stick it to tape, literally double-sided tape, like carpet tape, just like thick, nasty double-sided tape that you might use to, like, you know, hold something to your refrigerator if your refrigerator is stainless steel like ours is, or something like that. And what we do then is we use the laser to actually mine in from the outside of the grain. So we have the grain, we actually shoot the laser at the outside of it, and we remove layers of the grain with each pulse of the laser. And we dig our way into the grain. And what we can do then is we can measure that very thin rim early when we're measuring in the grain. And then as we get deeper and deeper into the grain, we run into the core. And so we get two measurements from a lot of these grains. We get a measurement of the very thin rim, and then we get a measurement of the core.
Did you devise this? Is anybody else doing this level of precision?
Yeah, there's a few labs that already do this. You know, we didn't come up with this. This is we had to develop our own methods for how we were going to do it in our lab. But the University of Texas at Austin, there's a guy there called Danny Stockley. He has been doing depth profiling of zircons for quite a number of years. And I chatted with him at a conference once about depth profiling. He has some students, Glenn Sharman being a notable one, who's also doing a lot of depth profiling now. And so we decided we would try to develop that technique in our lab. And so we tried it out. And it allows us to measure rims theoretically down to 1 micrometer in thickness. So 1/1000th of a millimeter thick, and get a reasonably precise date. In practice, we don't usually measure things less than 2 microns thick, so 2/1000th of a millimeter thick. And most of the rims are 5 microns-ish thick or thicker. And so that's kind of the limits of it. It's very squinty work. And we end up with these 2 ages. And the beauty of that is that we don't just get the age of the core, which is those Proterozoic ages generally. We get the age of the rim and the core on the same grain, and we can relate those 2 measurements.
Well, this is fascinating. You're doing a great job. Thank you. And viewers, we're going to come to your questions, I don't know, 15 minutes from now, but I'm trying to get a sense, is this the first time this has been done with the Nanaimo sediments?
Oh, yeah.
Or not necessarily?
Yes.
It is. Okay.
Yeah. So nobody's done this with the Nanaimo. And really, I haven't seen many papers that do what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is take rims that are in a detrital rock and learn something about the source area from those rims. What's often done this is called petrochronology, is we take a zircon with different growth domains from a metamorphic rock, and we try to figure out something about the metamorphic history of the rock from the zircons that are in it. But of course, we don't have the metamorphic rock. We just have sediment that eroded from the metamorphic rock. And so we're trying to infer what happened in the sediment source area from the metamorphic rims on zircons in our sedimentary rock. So it's like a step different than what most people do with petrochronology. And that's what made it sort of tricky to publish, because we're trying to argue about, the metamorphic grade of a rock that we don't have. We're trying to argue about the existence of a rock and the age of the rock and the detrital zircon populations in the rock, but we don't have that rock, right? We only have the sediment that eroded from it.
So this feels pretty important right here. So up until this paper, there's this debate back and forth, but can you confirm there's essentially no metamorphic rocks here that are similar to the metamorphic rims that you have in the Nanaimo?
Yeah, more or less. So what we can do with the rims is we can say that the rock that we're looking for must have been metamorphosed mostly between 95 million years and 72 million years.
Okay.
So the rim populations, those orangey rims, go from 95 to 72. All right. Remember, but that's the age of the rims. And so has nothing to do with the stratigraphic age of the rocks we find them in. That has everything to do with the age of the rims on the grains in the rock. Yeah, exactly. Now, the older sedimentary rocks, so the 84 million year old sedimentary rocks that we find these grains in, right? They have only older rims because, of course, the rims can't be any older than the rock that they're in, right? So principle of inclusion, right? A foundational principle of geology, right? That the parts of a rock have to be older than the rock itself, right? So in this case, an 84 million year old sedimentary rock would have these rims, but the rims would all be older than 84 million years. And it's only the very youngest rocks, the 63 million year old rocks, like the top of the basin, the Gabriola Formation, that has the rims that are as young as 72 million years. And so the rim ages that we find in any particular sample varies a little bit because they're always older than the deposit itself, the rock itself. And we can use all this information to tell us basically that, like, we know that metamorphism of the sedimentary of the source area is between about 95 and 72 million years. And then when we compare the age of the rims in the rock to the age of the rock itself, the depositional age of the sandstone that we got the grains from, we can say something about how fast that metamorphic rock must have gone from where it was being metamorphosed to surface. Because remember, to create the rim on the grain, it has to be deep in the crust, right? It has to be buried by some amount of rock.
Right.
And so if it's hot enough to produce a rim, say we'll go easy, we'll say at 90 million years, then it can't be forming sediment at 90 million years because it's still being metamorphosed. We have to get it to surface and then erode it and transport it to the basin and put it into the basin. And so if a 90 million year rock or 90 million year old rim on a grain is in a rock in the basin that's 80 million years old, then we know it took 10 million years to get from the metamorphic conditions to the surface to produce a sediment, to slide it off, put it in the basin into a rock that's 80 million years old. So we can calculate the exhumation rate or the cooling rate of the metamorphic source train. So when we take all that information, we compare it, it doesn't fit the Lemmy or the Mojave.
Yes. Wow. So let me, God, man, this is just great. I can't thank you enough. I'm super pumped. Are the rims,
I can back up if you need.
No. This is perfect. Are your rims so clear in your paper, like visually and all the data coming from it? Is that contentious that these rims exist or not?
No, that's basically a fact. So the presence of the rims, the fact that they grew probably in metamorphic conditions, that stuff is a fact. You know, nobody would look at these images and say that those are not rims or they don't exist or whatever. The things that will be contentious is the how this metamorphic and cooling history that we've proposed for the metasedimentary source rock, how that compares to the timing of metamorphism in the Mojave or the timing of metamorphism in the Lemhi. And there'll still be arguments about this. You know, this is not going to be like, you know, we've solved it all. But what's interesting about this is, of course, we find these rims on grains for like 20 million years of the basin's history. So from 84 to 63, we find these rim populations on grains in the basin. And the ages of them, the cores, like the ages of the cores, the relative proportions of the 1380 versus the 1700, the relative proportions of those different populations, it doesn't change. Once it shows up at 84 million years until the last time we see it at 63, when we run out of rock, right? We wander off the north shore of Hornby Island and we're standing in the ocean. There's no more rock to the north of us or the northwest or the northeast of us because there's ocean there. And we can't get any younger samples. So for that whole time, the old PCers look the same. Nothing is changing during that time. And throughout the basin, from the north to the south, the old PCers look the same everywhere you go in the basin. So it's the same zircon population with the same rims that shows up from 84 to 63 throughout the whole basin. And so this brings us to a very important point that Danny talked about last lecture or last meeting.
Yeah.
Is how do you do that if the basin is moving along the margin? Right. So let's take the short displacement models now first. So let's talk about, Sandra Wild's fault minimum model, where she said, if you do all the fault restorations in the Western Cordillera, do you have that one around?
Yeah. I've got something. Did you? And I don't want to. You're just kind of riffing here, and it's terrific. Like, did you have more slides you wanted to share? That was it feels
we'll see if they come up. I don't think I need them as yet. There's one at the end we'll talk about, which is the model. But yeah, so remember in when was that? The mid 2000s, I guess. Sandra Wild and Paul Umhofer put out a paper, and they took all the faults that we knew of and said, what happens if we restore them?
Right. And
it put the about 900 kilometers, like 1,000 or 900 kilometers south. Mm-hmm. Right. And that would put the Nanaimo Basin right about there. Yeah. Right about where you're pointing. So say the Nanaimo Basin's there at 84 million years. And then at 63 million years, it has to be further north, because by 55, it has to be in place. Right. That was the whole translation story you talked about with Basil. Right.
Yep.
So during that time, it's going to move maybe 900, 1,000 kilometers. And how is it possible that the same river that brought its sediment at 84 million years is still bringing its sediment at 63 million years when it's potentially, 1,000 kilometers further north, right? Imagine a river flowing through Los Angeles today, bringing sediment to some basin offshore Los Angeles, and now move whatever that basin is north 1,000 kilometers to the California-Oregon border, and have the same river bringing its sediment there. It doesn't compute, right? Like, it doesn't make sense. Right. And there should be what we should expect to see, I think. And Bernie Housen and or Housen, I'm never sure how you say his name. Housen.
Yeah.
Housen. Okay. Bernie Housen and Merle Beck, in their 1999 paper on the detrital zircons, they suggested that maybe we see a transport stratigraphy where, early on in the deposition, we get a signal that looks like the south. During the middle of the basin's deposition, we get some kind of signal coming from the middle of the basin or the middle of the continent. And then later on, we get a signal further north, right? We're picking up. Yeah.
That's why I wanted confetti, because I imagined everything was so varied, but I got to get rid of the confetti now, because
you've done excellent with the blue. The blue is great because it's all the same, right? It's just like ding, 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 blue, 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 right? And so imagine, here's your wallet analogy, right? So imagine you went on a trip, and I know you've been on a trip because you have, baggage tags on your luggage, and you just, came back in a tag to your house, and you got a nice suntan. And clearly you haven't been in Washington in months. And I say, show me your wallet. I want to see where you've been. And it's all pesos. It's nothing but pesos, right? Well, you could say, well, I went to Mexico, then I went to Guatemala, and then I flew down to Colombia, then I went over to Argentina, and I went all these other places. But your wallet only shows me pesos. What am I supposed to do with that? I have no evidence that you took all these elaborate tours around South and Central America, apparently, because the only thing in your wallet is pesos. So the only thing in the Nanaimo Basin is this one Facies 2 signature that Danny was talking about that you've illustrated. And so for either model, whether you're moving the basin, 2,000 plus kilometers because you're into the Paleomag and you think that the insular supertrain was way south, or you only move it 900, 1,000 kilometers because you only believe the fault minimum model. Either way, you have this problem of how do you create 20 million years of homogeneous sediment delivery to the basin? And so with these two thoughts, we've got these rim populations that say, we've got this timing of metamorphism, and it looks like it's coming from metasedimentary rock. And then we've got the problem that we don't see a transport stratigraphy. And we put these two things together and said, okay, how can we solve both of those problems with a model that agrees with the paleomagnetic data? So you often ask your guests, why do you believe the paleomag? Well, I believe the paleomag because one of the first things I did as a geoscientist was paleomagnetism. So I was in 1998, I was a second year undergraduate student at the University of Waterloo. And I had a work term in Ottawa at the Geological Survey of Canada, which I might add is interesting that the Geological Survey of Canada is older than Canada. So it formed before Canada became a country,
Wow.
which is awkward. I'm not sure what they called it. The Geological Survey of North America. I'm not sure.
Right.
So anyhow, I did some paleomag for them, and I sat in a magnetically shielded room and did all the measurements and just chatted to a paleomagnetist constantly for like a month and a half, 2 months, while I sat there bored to tears making these measurements. It was super monotonous work, but I learned a ton. And so I've always viewed paleomagnetism as like, it's a real science. There are people who do it who can correct for all the potential problems, who can understand the limitations of it. And so I've always taken it as like, unless you have some compelling reason to disbelieve the paleomagnetism, then I disbelieve it. And so what we tried to do with our paleogeography and provenance model was to say, how can we reconcile the understanding of the zircons with the paleomagnetic constraints? And so I will go back to my slides just really briefly, and I'm just going to go on 2 slides. And so we have this really simple model. This is the kind of model you publish when you're worried about trying to publish a model, and the tectonics editor keeps poking you and saying, we really want you to put a model in your paper. Please put a model in your paper. And I finally said, okay, fine. I didn't want to do it, and I did it. And here it is. And so this CI here, this is Central Idaho. This is, I'm pretty convinced now that Central Idaho, the Lemhi Subbasin, the Idaho batholith was a pretty significant source of sediment. And the cores, not the rims, but the cores in the Nanaimo Basin sure look like they come from Central Idaho. So I've come around on that. Okay. Yeah, there's problems, but I've come around a bit. So we suspect that sediment from Central Idaho got out here. This is the subduction zone. Here's the insular superterranean. There's the intramontane. It got out here somehow along the trench and came down to essentially the latitudes of Southern California. And we know that happened. It's hard to imagine how it happened, but we know it did. And I'm just going to drop back to 3 slides. And we know it happened because these blue dots represent places where we see our facies to the old PCers. These are all the places that we find that signature today along the margin. And you'll notice that there's a whole bunch of them down here in Southern California. They're found in deposits that were underplated beneath Southern California and the Mojave Desert, in the late Cretaceous. And they're also found in the Nacimiento and all these things that restore back into, this area. They're found in the Franciscan. They're found all over the place in Southern California. So while I don't like this idea that sediment can come out of here and then get all the way down to Southern California, it appears to have happened based on the available evidence that we have. So what we argue happened was this stuff was deposited in the subduction zone, and then it was underplated beneath North America to become this gray box right here. That underplating process took sediment from Central Idaho and probably a mixture of some stuff from the Coast Mountains batholith and some other things, and metamorphosed it between, say, starting at around 95 million years. So by taking it and shoving it down a subduction zone, we increase the temperature, we increase the pressure, and we start to metamorphose those sediments to create a metasedimentary rock. That happened just after the hit, right? So the insular is here against Western North America, and then we deposit these rocks and we shove them underneath North America. And at that time, right before 84 million years, the Nanaimo Basin didn't see any of these old PCers. That population of grains wasn't around. And the only sediment we get in the basin, this is this yellow blob right here, was stuff coming from the pink thing, which is the Coast Mountains batholith. So that's just the part of the insular supertrain, right? That's just that big, the Coast Plutonic complex is also called. But then at 84 million years, we suspect that the plate tectonics of the Pacific Basin changed a little bit. And some of that gray material that was underplated gets exhumed along the new plate boundary, along the edge of the insular supertrain. And that material, which is now this exhumed metasedimentary rock, is what feeds into the Nanaimo Basin. And because it's part of the block, right, it's outboard of this strike slip fault that's going to take the insular supertrain and move it northward, it can be a sediment source for the Nanaimo Basin the whole way as it's moving north, right? So we've got ongoing exhumation of that rock through tectonic or erosional processes, and it keeps sort of coming into the basin for the whole time that it's moving northward. It's starting to get dark here. I got a window over there that's shining on me. I hope the light on my head isn't too bright. I've got a window that's shining the sun. If I had hair, it would be less of a problem. But
your concentration is excellent. You made it through that phone call on the answering machine like 20 minutes ago. That was beautifully done. And I'm going to take advantage of this right now. Like that little black strip, that little exposed metasedimentary that's coming north. Do we know that as a unit today?
No. So the problem here is that we are invoking from the evidence that we have in the basin, we have to invoke that there was this rock that existed, right? We know its properties. We know that it was deposited after 84 million years, or starting at 100 and then as late as 84, and that it was metamorphosed between 95-ish and 72. And we know it was probably an amphibolite grade, so pretty high grade metamorphic rock. To make rims like that, it has to be pretty hot. And it might have been even hotter than an amphibolite. And so we know a lot of its properties, but when you look around the map today in the north, you don't see it. So there are rocks that are like it. The Swakane gneiss is very much like the rock that we're invoking, but the Swakane gneiss isn't quite old enough, and it was metamorphosed a little bit too late, and it didn't come to the surface until the Cenozoic. So we know it's not the Swakane gneiss, but it's something like the Swakane gneiss, right? The Swakane gneiss has exactly the same Precambrian zircon populations in it that the Nanaimo Basin has, right? That's kind of a known fact too. Now that we know that, Kirsten Sauer figured that out with Stasia Gordon. Danny Coots has compared them all. They're the same. They're the same zircons. So that rock is very much like the rock that we think was the sediment source, but it wasn't the rock. So you have to hide it somehow. You have to obscure it. Either it has to be obscured by tectonics. So in my model, I show it, maybe as you reaccrete the insular supertrain to the intermontane, maybe it gets buried under the thrusts that are buried along the suture somehow, right? We know that the insular supertrain didn't just move north and then just stop. It kind of moved north and then got sort of shoved into the margin, right? And kind of shoved, as it got shoved in, maybe something got overthrust over top of this rock, hiding it. Or maybe it eroded away. 84 million years ago, it was at surface and it was eroding rapidly enough to fill a sedimentary basin with detritus. So 84 million years at the edge of an active continental margin, maybe it just eroded away. I mean, I don't know. And it's the big weakness that people will point to and say, well, if you can't see the rock, then you can't call it, the source.
That sounds familiar.
And it's a common problem with provenance interpretations, right? If you're doing provenance in the modern, so say you've got a modern sediment, sitting on the beach, then I should be able to point into the drainage and say, this zircon grain came from that pluton because its age matches that pluton. And because it's in the modern, right, the sediment transport from that pluton to the beach is short. It's like thousands of years at most, probably not even that much for most rivers. So it's easy to say, like, I can see the zircon, I can see the source. But when you go into deep time, so we're talking, 80 million years ago in our case, or 100 million years ago, or Cambrian rocks or Proterozoic rocks, right? Provenance gets to be a lot more tricky because the rock that was at surface in, say, the Cambrian, to bring a zircon to a Cambrian rock, right, can't be at surface today because there's been 500 million years of erosion and the maps change, right? We're slowly eroding our way through the crust. And so I can't point to that rock today and say, look, there it is. That's the source for the Nanaimo Basin. But I don't think that that should be a necessary requirement of any provenance model because we expect things to change through time.
Yeah. Oh, God. Well, this is just amazing. I'm just having a ball. And viewers, I promise 5 more minutes and we're coming to you. But I cut you off. You had one more panel on your model. Did you want to go back to that?
Yeah. Okay. So this is what I was talking about here. So you see this black strip here that's in this middle part of the model. As we go north, right, it conveniently disappears because I have to match the map pattern today. You can't show this thing at surface today if it's not there. And so I've suggested that as we reaccrete the insular back to the intermontane in its roughly current position, maybe it gets hidden underneath this thrust fault. And that's just one idea for how it could have. It's the simplest to draw. That's why I drew it that way. That's one idea for how it might have gone away. We don't know, right? And we can't know. And people often use the eroded remains of orogenic belts and arcs that we find in basins to infer the history of the source area, right? We study foreland basins to try to understand fold and thrust belt evolution, to understand origins. We study forearc basins sometimes to understand, what was going on with the active arc beside it through time, because the sedimentary basin provides like a tape recorder essentially of processes that were happening in the sediment source area. And so in the Nanaimo Basin, we have a record of this metasedimentary source that we think was, as I've shown it, but there are other options, right? Maybe all these rims come from the Lemhi, right? Maybe this is characteristic of sediment coming from the Lemhi subbasin. And the geologic history of the Lemhi subbasin that I compared to is incorrect, inaccurate, incomplete. Use some in word and then, apply that to this situation. And so we think that there's a super simple test of our hypothesis, right? I showed you before that there was all those blue dots along the margin of all the places where these rocks outcrop or these zircons have been found.
Let's look at it again.
Sure, I'll go back a couple here. So there you go. So there's all of these places where we might be able to go and get another sample that has this same pre-Cambrian zircon population in it, where the rock is in a less contentious position. We know that this, for instance, this sample from the Great Valley Forearc right here hasn't moved very far relative to North America and relative to the Lemhi subbasin since it was deposited. So if we were to take this rock and do the same kind of analysis that we did on the Nanaimo Basin, we could look at the rim populations in that rock. And if we found rim populations like we find in the Nanaimo Basin, well, then our hypothesis is wrong, right? That would disprove us immediately. So all we would have to do is take the rock, do the depth profiling. If we get a wild range of zircon rims that are from 95 to 72 million years old, and they have roughly the same uranium thorium ratios and the same population statistics that we found, then I'd be like, okay, right, great. So sediment coming from the Lemhi subbasin, that's what it looks like. My story is bunk. I don't think that's going to happen, but that's the test, right? That's what somebody needs to do. And we just need to get the samples. We need to get some time on a laser. We need to, blast some zircons, which is always a fun thing to do. I mean, I would almost do that for sport. And then we could know for sure.
Well, I mean, the possibilities are endless with all those blue dots. You're saying all those blue dots in California have not been checked with this technique to see if they have rims or not?
Correct. And when you look at their isotopic data and you look at what people have written about the dating they did, there's no mention of the kind of difficulties that these rims produce when you try to measure these grains. If If you just walk into one of these samples from the Nanaimo Basin and start measuring things, you find a horrific mess, right? It's very difficult to measure these grains. And people do, they pick around and they work their way around all the complexities and they get good data, but nobody has mentioned it. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't find these problems. They just didn't record it in the publications. And so I don't know. So I can just read the papers and I can say, well, these people didn't mention any problems and those people didn't mention any problems and these people didn't mention any rims. And to me, that looks like they don't have rims like we found in the Nanaimo Basin, because it's really, really obvious. Like it's not subtle. This is sledgehammer geology, right? Like it hits you in the head. Like you're like, wow, okay, these are really obvious. So I would hope that if they were obvious, people would mention them, but it's possible they didn't. And so the test would be to just depth profile almost any of these blue dots would work just great.
Well, yes, and it's not like you're talking about 17 grains either. We're talking about thousands of grains that have come through your lab, right? That all have the same story.
That's right. And all of the samples that have that detrital zircon signature has those Precambrian samples have the rims on them. It's every grain that has that Precambrian core has a rim. And so, you know, it's not a subtle test. It would be very easy to solve this problem. We just haven't done it yet. We don't have access to the samples, but you know, that's usually a small hurdle. It's the access to the money to do it. Depth profiling is slow. It's expensive on a laser, but it can be done.
Sure. One more from me, and then viewers, I promise we're coming to you right now after this last question from me. You came around on the Idaho source for the detrital part of those grains. Weren't you arguing against Idaho grains totally until recently? What changed your mind?
Well, you know, time, age, maturity, more reading, lots of things. You know, even in my 2017 paper, Calgary's first paper on the Nanaimo talking about provenance, we acknowledged that there were traits of that population which were difficult to source from anywhere else in North America that we knew of. And so we said, you know, maybe it's still coming from the Mojave. There are reasons we like that. First off, it agrees with all the paleo-latitudinal constraints, but there's other reasons about the grain population that fit fairly well with the Mojave. But, you know, the 1380 population is very difficult to get from the Mojave. And so that's a big strike against the Mojave. There's lots of plutons down there that are like 1400, 1420. But 1380 is really rare. So to get that be the dominant population is difficult to explain from the Mojave. And then there's grains that fall in this enigmatic North American magmatic gap. So there's this period of time in North America where we don't have a lot of magmatism. And it's from about 1610 to, I don't know, 1540. I'm probably butchering the dates, but it's like 1500. Think of it as 1500s. Yeah. We don't get a lot of grains. So if you just look at like zircon grains from North America, just do a big mashup of them, you don't get a lot of 1500s. And there are 1500s in the Nanaimo group. And we think that those come from western parts of the Belt Purcell. There's some sedimentary rocks there that have those grain ages in them. And so that could be where those are coming from. And so those are really good arguments for a central Idaho source. And so we just have to say, you know, it looks like central Idaho. We have to do this really long southerly transit to get it down to Southern California, but that happened. We don't know how. That's an interesting problem that somebody should work on. And then, you know, the story goes from there as we like to tell it. Yeah.
So is it too strong to say you've given up on the Mojave as being a source?
Yeah, I don't think these grains can come from the Mojave for two reasons. One, the core ages are tough to explain with the Mojave, and two, that whole transport stratigraphy problem. If the grains are coming from the Mojave, how the hell do you keep them coming to the basin for 20 million years? Right. It moves north. Right.
You know? Wow. Oh, this is just amazing. Wow. Let me get rid of some X-rated spam at the same time. And we go to your viewers' questions. Hide user in this channel. Okay. Uppercase, please. Do you have, I mean, you did such a great job. You could leave us right now, but you got a few more minutes, Will, for some questions.
I do.
These guys?
Yeah, I've got time. Yeah, no problem.
Wonderful. Oscar from San Diego asks, do the rims accrete onto the zircons, or does the zircon edge metamorphose into the rims?
Nice. Both. So you can get metamorphic zircon growth through a whole bunch of different mechanisms. And I love how you termed that accreting. So we would just call it growing, but you can grow new metamorphic zircon. So you have a core, and then the zircon gets bigger because we actually add material to the outside of it. And that happens because zirconium-rich fluids are circulating through the rock, and they're looking for a place to attach, and they're really compatible with zircon. That's why we call it zircon. It's because it's full of zirconium. And they attach to the zircon, and they make the zircon bigger. And we can grow rims that way. But we can also what's called transgressive recrystallization or recrystallization. So we take a zircon, and I'm trying to do it so I'm actually in the camera, and the zircon stays the same size, but there's a reaction rim that goes through it, and we end up with a small core inside a reaction rim, which is a transgressively recrystallized part. And a lot of the ones that I showed you in that picture were, actually about half of them were one type, and the other half were the other type. And I didn't want to get into that in the picture because I don't want to scare users off with like petrochronology of zircons. I really dig it, but I'm a total zircon lab geek. So,
well, you didn't scare anybody off. Everybody's got questions now, and that's the whole point of this. Gondwana asks, can those zircons come from a sedimentary rock that formed from those Precambrian plutons?
Yes, I think that is possible. But so if Central Idaho is the source, then these zircons that are in the Nanaimo Basin have an incredibly complex history, because the Lemhi subbasin is a Proterozoic sedimentary rock. Right. So it's a sedimentary rock that contains zircon grains from its source area, which was southwestern Laurentian, right?
Wow.
And then they eroded from southwestern Laurentia. They ended up in the Lemhi, in rocks of the Belt Purcell. And then they were metamorphosed and intruded by 1380 MA granites, which are now all metamorphosed. Then that was eroded. That ended up in the trench, which was then metamorphosed again, which became the sediment source for the Nanaimo. So you see, like, it's this incredible problem of recycling. Zircons are amazingly durable. They don't break down chemically. They are hard to erode because they have a very high hardness. And so once you've created a zircon, it's sort of around for the long haul. It's very hard to get rid of it. And so it's possible that these zircons actually went through a sedimentary cycle before the sedimentary cycle that produced the metasedimentary rock, which went through another sedimentation cycle to produce the Nanaimo Basin. So you see, like, once you create these zircons, they just kick around forever. And it's fairly well documented. Some of the people I've collaborated with have documented, recycling on the order of billions of years of recycling of the same zircons. Once you put them on a margin, they're there forever.
Holy cow, what a mind blower.
Yeah.
Albert, we got Gary from Alberta, maybe Calgary, I forget. How do you metamorphose just the grain rim and not the core?
Yeah, it's because it takes time. So theoretically, if you metamorphose the rock for long enough, you could completely eradicate the original grain. So that transgressive recrystallization that's making the core smaller, if we waited long enough, the core would just disappear and the grain would be an entirely metamorphic grain. That doesn't seem to be what happens. You don't often get grains that are just an entirely metamorphic grain. Often they have a core in them, and that's maybe to do with time scales of metamorphism, right? That we don't tend to metamorphose rocks at high enough conditions for long enough. They tend to get metamorphosed and then brought back to surface or cooled off again, right? That's, geology is all about sort of cyclical processes. And so it may just be that we never give them enough time. But theoretically, there's no reason why that reaction rim, that transgressive recrystallization, wouldn't entirely eliminate the grain if we gave it enough time. Mm-hmm. And the rims vary in thickness. Some of them are really, really thin, which means that we had just a little bit of recrystallization and then it all stopped, probably because the rock was being cooled to become part of the Nanaimo Basin. And then in some of them, the rim is much, much thicker. And there's all sorts of reasons why it might go faster or slower. The rim of the zircon might be more damaged. It might have more defects in its crystal lattice. That might make it easier to recrystallize. But this is all very complicated stuff that really we have some idea how it works. And there are metamorphic petrologists who know it much better than me. John Cottle, for instance, in Australia, has published some amazing stuff about zircon. Paul Hoskin has done some amazing stuff with zircon petrochronology. I am certainly not an expert, but that's why I think it may just be time frames. We just don't metamorphose it for long enough to get rid of it entirely.
But you're imagining subduction somehow related with the metamorphism, or not necessarily?
Yeah, so there's some rocks that look like the rock that we're proposing. They're in California. They're the Pelona Orocopian Rand schists. There's big block of sediment that was underplated beneath California. They sort of dominate the geological story of the late Cretaceous of California. They're a huge player in it. And those are subduction related rocks. And we think that the processes that affected our rock that we're proposing are similar to those that affected the Pelona Orocopian Rand schists. And that's why we invoke subduction, underplating being the process. Yeah.
Thanks. This is great. We'll do a few more. Viewers, thank you for all the questions. I'm back a little ways. Max asks, do the zircons have to be deposited by a river, or could they be wind blown?
So there are lots of places where we get wind-blown deposits. The Aeolian deposits, the Jurassic ergs of Western North America. You know, when you go down to Utah, you know, Colorado, Utah, you see like, you know, the Wingate and the all those big, you know, what's the Wingate's the one that came to mind. But, you know, there's all those big sandstone cliffs that form Monument Valley and arches and all those things, right? Those are all wind-blown deposits, and we know what they look like. They have a certain sedimentary character and stratigraphic character to them because they're big dunes, right? The Nanaimo Basin deposits are they're clearly deposited, as you talked about in your introduction, you know, in marine conditions underwater. Now, the zircons could have been delivered to the basin by the wind, right? That is possible. We could have a wind blowing across the source area, picking up zircons, blowing it some distance across North America, and then depositing it. We don't see any need for that, though, with the observations we've made. So that's a more complicated story, right? Maybe it could be, but we don't see a need for that, right? The deep water sedimentary systems are often fed by rivers that flow to a shelf and deposit sediments that then become part of the deep water system. And that's kind of how we've gone with our interpretations.
God, you're doing great, Will. How about three more?
Sure.
BH asks, maybe I missed something obvious, but could the grains come from the west rather than the east, like off of the insular itself?
That is a good question. So we know the age of the basement beneath the Nanaimo Basin, right? It's the Wrangellia terrain. And there's been lots of dating done by a group out of Simon Fraser University that have done a ton of detrital zircon dating at the bottom of the Nanaimo Basin. And the reason I'm bringing them up is that those deposits are sourced from Wrangellian basement itself. And so people have dated the basement themselves, like, you know, directly. They said, okay, how old's the Sicker? How old's the Carmoots? And these are all parts of Wrangellia. And the oldest parts of that are 450 million years old. That's by far the oldest parts. The oldest grains that we see that are eroded from the basement in the Nanaimo Basin are the same. They're like 440, 450 million years old. So there's no evidence that there's anything older than Paleozoic in Wrangellia itself. And so there's no source for, you know, 1380, 1700 million year grains in Wrangellia, based on the evidence that we have from directly dating the rocks and the detrital zircons that derive from it in the Cretaceous, which don't contain any ages older than that.
Yeah. Two more and we're done. Chris, where did your question go, Chris? Hang on. Is diffusion of other elements into a zircon able to help distinguish the location of the metamorphism?
Ooh, interesting. So during metamorphism of a zircon, we tend to get diffusion of things out of the zircon. And so when a zircon crystallizes, it incorporates uranium and excludes lead from its crystal lattice. And that's why it's such a great geochronometer. It doesn't have a bunch of non-radiogenic lead that was incorporated during the formation of the grain. So it's very easy to date. When we metamorphose it, a lead that has formed from the decay of uranium is incompatible in the crystal lattice, and it will actually diffuse out during recrystallization. So when we form that rim, it's the same zircon that was there before, but now it's giving us a young age because all the lead that was formed by the early part of the history of the grain diffuses out. I haven't seen a lot of literature that suggests things would diffuse into the zircon grain. I'm pretty sure I haven't seen a mention of that. So it's more of a loss than we yet see things coming into the crystal. It's very hard to get things to enter a crystal lattice. So imagine you've got a crystal lattice, there's very neat arrangement of atoms of all this repeating pattern in chemistry. Trying to get an element to go from in a fluid to break through and get into the crystal lattice to diffuse into the grain is very energetically difficult to do on an atomic level. And so I don't think that's a thing. I'm not an expert in that though, so I don't know.
Right. Last one. Boy, this has just been a thrill. Combination of like 3 questions I saw.
Okay.
You're not a 10, it sounds like, or are you? Like, do you want anything coming from Baja? Your work is saying Southern Cal at the limit as far as moving the Baja BC block?
Yeah, so I have crazier ideas than a lot of people that I know that I haven't been sharing because they're crazy. And if my crazy idea were right, then California is the place to be. And I haven't managed to convince myself to write that paper yet because I just feel like I get beat up for it and it wouldn't go well. But I think California is the place, and a lot of very interesting things happened in Southern California in the late Cretaceous, and in my big worldview of how this all might work, a lot of those things that happen, the interesting things that happen, are compatible with the Baja BC story. And so I tend to stop there. Also, remember Nanaimo group, paleomag is like 1,600 kilometers if you correct for all the inclination flattening and all the problems it has. You know, Margie Russmore's recent insular superterrain, Pluton dates from the Night Inlet area, right? Or sorry, Night Inlet paleomagnetisms like 2,300. A lot of the estimates for the outermost part of the insular superterrain are sort of in that sort of 2,000 meters of translation or 2,000 kilometers of translation range. And so I'm on the short side of it. I like the sort of 1,900 kilometers of displacement. It's also compatible. I know you have Kirsten Sauer and Stasia Gordon coming on your show, right? They did the Mojave BC model in a 2019 geology paper. Yeah. And they talked about the Swakane being equivalent to the Piora schists. And they put it sort of in that area too, you know, Southern California-ish, based on the evidence that they saw. And that's why I'm stuck in Southern California.
Got it. Well, I mean, you're so good. I hope there's more we can look forward to. Are you going to be right? Do you have more students that you're involved with, or what can we look forward to from you?
Yeah, so I actually left academia mostly anyways. I'm not doing a very good job of it. It's like I decide to leave and then I kind of keep doing it anyways. In May of this year, I now am in the process of trying to find a job, and I sit in my house and I write papers. And right now what I'm doing actually is trying to clear the backlog of student work that I haven't published from when I was a professor and I had students. So I have a paper I'm working on right now on the Pacific Rim terrain and the Leech River schist, which are geologic elements at the southern end of Vancouver Island and in the Tofino Ucluelet area. So this is the very western edge of Vancouver Island and south. So Victoria is on the Leech River schist. And I'm in the process of working with Dante Canil at UVic to put together a paper on that. And then I'm going to move to Haida Gwaii. I got a paper I need to produce up there from a student, Cam Dorsey. So I've got all sorts of ththings to write, and that's going to be what I'm focusing on for the next little while in my academic pursuits.
Oh, I can't wait to read more from you. I mean, it's just been a real pleasure to meet you, and I'm sure everybody's enjoyed this conversation. I don't even have to look. I know that they've enjoyed this conversation. So thank you so much for all your energy. Oh, you just did a great job. So
great.
Will, thank you very much, and we'll talk to you down the road. How about that?
Great. Thanks a lot. Okay. See you again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Oh, baby. Will I Am from Calgary, Alberta. That was Dr. William Matthews. I know you guys say, I'm going to have to watch that one again or whatever. I think I'm going to have to watch this one again. Man, come on now. There was a lot to digest there, and I hope that you enjoyed it. That paper waits for you, and maybe our conversation will be helpful as you read it again or read it for the first time. Available at nickzentner.com. Secure. Before I say goodbye, let me remind you of a scheduling change for the rest of December. It's dark. There's not a whole lot else going on, so I'm doubling up this coming weekend and the following weekend as well. So both Saturday and Sunday, December 10th and December 11th, we will have shows at 9 a.m. Pacific. And the following weekend, you can see as well another Saturday morning and Sunday morning show, both at 9 o'clock. I have guests lined up for most of the letters, not all. I'm still working on that. But to continue the, it's not a trilogy. What do you call 4 shows? To complete the 4th of the 4 Nanaimo bar shows from Vindman's Baker, you've got to love it. This coming Saturday, Session G will feature Brian Mahoney from Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and Paul Link from Pocatello, Idaho. And they are both former Badgers, as I am, and we all used to hang out together in Pocatello. So these guys have a lot to say about the Nanaimo, and that should be an interesting show. Hope you enjoy this coming Saturday. And if you missed me say it earlier, this coming Sunday at 9 a.m., Erin Donaghy, who you remember from the Crazy Eocene series. I think she made 3 appearances. And yeah, I'll reveal what we're going to talk about, I suppose, on Saturday. A toast to you. Here's to you for joining us today. Here's to your health. Sunheit. Here's to the health of your family and friends and everyone in your community. I hope everything's going just as well as can be expected in your world these days. Here's to Will Matthews, who did an amazing job. That's my opinion. Hopefully yours too. Here's to Will. And here's to Danny Coots, the previous show, and Jerome Lessman, the show before that. We've got Nanaimo galore. Nanaimo up the yin-yang. And one more show is coming on Saturday. Gross. Thank you, dear viewers. Hope things go well for you the rest of the week, and I look forward to seeing some of you live both Saturday and Sunday this weekend, 9 a.m. Pacific time. Thank you. I love you, and goodbye from Ellensburg, Washington, USA. End stream.